قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين، فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء، إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم، ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. I have with me a critical mind, a dynamic speaker, intriguing discussion. I'd like to welcome Lina Khatib. She is the head of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House and a research associate at SOAS. Lina has done some phenomenal work in terms of security, political transformation or transitions, foreign policy, and has focused significantly on Syria, and that is where I want to take my discussion today. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, Lina. I know I dragged you out at this late hour, but thank you for entertaining me.
Well, thank you so much. It's actually always a pleasure to engage in meaningful conversations.
Alhamdulillah. So I just want to start very quickly with the Syrian conflict. Okay, there has been two very separate narratives that have come from it. On the one hand, Assad is the good guy, and ISIS and the Syrian armed resistance, etc., are the bad ones. On the other hand, we have the opposite, where Assad is the authoritarian dictator, and of course these are the freedom fighters. And there are people who are caught between these two narratives, not quite sure what to do, because we know that the situation on the ground is very volatile, that alliances and solidarity's resistance keeps changing hand, the plot keeps changing, and we find that people generally are at a loss. What is the most simplest explanation?
Well, the simplest explanation is that neither of those two narratives is accurate. The first narrative that pits the current regime under President Bashar al-Assad as being on the good side, fighting a myriad of terrorists, is very simplistic. Yes, there are terrorists in Syria. Daesh, ISIS, is one clear example of that. But the problem is that the Syrian regime has characterized anyone that is in opposition to the regime as being a terrorist. And that is, of course, inaccurate, because a lot of these people are moderates, they're activists, they are not terrorists, and all they wanted from the regime was a degree of political reform and freedom. On the other hand, the second narrative that completely vilifies the regime while at the same time saying, oh, but everyone that is fighting the regime is a good kind of actor, is equally inaccurate. And that's because, yes, the regime is definitely a brutal regime, it's autocratic, it is engaging in a systematic process of killing civilians and killing its opponents without discrimination. But on the other side, unfortunately, not everyone that is claiming to fight the regime is necessarily a good actor. So you have a number of extremist groups, for example, in Syria, that have started to exist as a result of the conflict. They are fighting the regime, but their own practices are also autocratic and problematic.
So they're not offering anything better?
Yeah, but there is a third way. What we have to remember is that the people caught in between are not just the people not affiliated and who have nothing to do with the conflict. Actually, the activists that I talked about, who are moderate, who are basically calling for reform and rights, these are the actors that often get missed, especially in media debate, because the media very often cover the conflict from a black and white perspective, good guys and bad guys. It's easy for the audience to understand. Unfortunately, sometimes even policymakers fall into the same trap. But what I'm saying is that in Syria, even today, we still have people who are activists, who are trying to resist autocracy, whether it comes from the regime or whether it comes from extremist groups.
Yes, so basically people are saying that, no, if you're presenting a program of liberation, then don't come in with a coercive agenda, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is essentially about fighting coercion, no matter who is responsible for this coercion.
There is another narrative that is very pronounced, and of course this was used extensively throughout the conflict, and it became a big thing in the South African scenario as well, and that of sectarianism. That, like Iraq, Syria again is a sectarian war. What is your response to that?
Well, Syria is not Iraq. Iraq had a sectarian problem that was stoked over decades of negligence by different governments, of communities, of people that didn't come from the same community as the leaders. So under Saddam Hussein in Iraq, for example, Sunnis had more privileges than the Shia. And then after the ousting of Saddam Hussein during the rule of mainly Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki, who was Shia, he basically did the same kind of, yeah, absolutely, towards Sunnis, causing grievances in the Sunni community. But Syria is different. Syria did not have a sectarian problem before this conflict. What happened with the conflict is that the Syrian regime, which is an Alawi regime, used fear of mainly Sunni Islamic jihadism, extremism, to kind of say to people, we are the only alternative, the regime is the only alternative, and if you are not loyal to the regime, then these extremist Sunnis are going to rule Syria. This, of course, scared the minorities in Syria, the Christians, the Alawis, and the Shia. But at the same time, this kind of glossed over the fact that the regime itself had a bit of a transactional relationship with the Sunnis in Syria anyway, who occupied some positions of power, had some high-level positions in the army. So the president of Syria basically created a sectarian problem that did not exist with this conflict. And what added to the situation is the intervention of Iran to support the regime, which started spreading a basically Shia-dominated sectarian message in order to rally support at the grassroots level. Again, saying that there is a Sunni jihadi, as they call it, takfiri threat that we need to kind of safeguard us against. And at the same time, you had entities like ISIS, which used similar sectarian narrative in order to say to the Sunni community, see, you are being discriminated against by this apostate regime and its Shia allies, and therefore we need a sense of Sunni solidarity against them. So as you can see, multiple actors in this conflict stoked sectarianism and created a sectarianism problem.
So basically using religion to influence power, or different areas of religion to get the support, and then of course to consolidate.
I mean, basically what we're seeing in Syria is the use of religion as a tool of conflict.
Yeah, they're trading religion basically to buy constituencies,
yeah,
maybe legitimacy.
Yeah.
There is, like I said to you earlier, I was reading the book, well, I read the book by Leila Shami, yes, and Yassin al-Kassab on the burning country, referring to Syria, and they speak about how sectarianism was actually then extended through the use of shabiha, which is these ghosts, that took on different identities depending on which community they were going to threaten, ostracize, or maybe even instill fear. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically the Shabiha are a group of thugs affiliated with regime figures, and they have existed in Syria since the 70s. But what happened with the conflict is that the regime instrumentalized these thugs and used them in order to terrorize the population. So they were sent in certain cases to terrorize and kill protesters who were protesting against the regime. But sometimes they were also sent to loyalist areas that were loyal to the regime, and basically caused the residents of those areas to think that they were under the attack by people from the other side, meaning by the Sunnis or people in general who rose against the regime. And here we have to remember that the people who rose against the regime in Syria were not just Sunnis. Yes. They came from all kinds of communities, including the Alawi community that the regime comes from. But because Syria is mostly Sunni in terms of the numbers of people in the population, of course, most of the people that rose against the regime happen to be Sunni. It's just about demographic proportion. Anyway, so the Shabiha played a role in terrorizing everybody in Syria.
But that was they worked for the government, so it was an instrument of the government.
Absolutely, because the government wanted to scare even its own loyalists and say, you are under the threat of these basically Sunni jihadist groups. And sometimes explosions would be orchestrated or terrorist incidents, and they would be blamed on jihadists. But actually, it was the regime that was orchestrating these kinds of incidents.
So we have to go to a break now. But when we come back, there's two things I want to talk about, which have surfaced a lot recently. And that is the use of rapism a weapon of war inside of Syria, which seems to be a very big issue. And secondly, to look at how the regime has now managed to create this narrative that in order to be successful, you have to befriend the devil you know rather than the devil you don't. So stick with Assad and his regime, rather than allowing the Syrian people the ability or the potential to choose their own independence. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me today in the ITV networks with Lina Khatib, and we're talking about Syria. Now, Lina, as I said to you before we went into the break, there's been a very big shift in the way in which the war is now being unpacked. It's actually not even the conflict, because they refer to it as a Syrian conflict initially. And I think it's much more than that, because we see the use of terrible weapons coming from different states. It is a war, it's a proxy war in many ways that's happening in Syria. It's not only a conflict between the civil society or the people of Syria against the government. This is a full-fledged war. Different countries practicing their own things, and in many ways also we've come to understand that other countries are testing their weapons in Syria as they did in Iraq, and they're doing in Palestine as well, specifically if you look at Russia. So you spoke about Iran's influence in Syria. There was a strong denial for the longest time that Iran was in Syria, that it was influencing and maybe in many ways sustaining this brutality against the Syrian people. Now some people have come to realize there's others who are still denying it. But part of that is a particular argument that has come forward, which said that both Iran, Hezbollah and the Syrian regime are responsible for a significant amount of terror perpetrated against the Syrian people in terms of their dignity, and that is rape as a weapon of war. What can you tell me about that?
Well, unfortunately, rape as a weapon of war is not limited to any one side in this regime, in this context, I'm sorry. So if we are looking at the situation of women in conflict in Syria or even in Iraq, we see that different actors use this because family honor is very important in this particular part of the world, and especially women's honor. So if you disgrace a woman, then you are disgracing her whole family, her whole clan, her whole tribe. And this is why this weapon, unfortunately, has become so prevalent in Syria. So we have Syrian soldiers, militias fighting on the side of the regime, raping women from the other side. And we also have, of course, Daesh, ISIS, also not just using rape, but the detention of women as basically war kind of rewards being also used in order to terrorize people. So unfortunately, women are at the forefront of basically bearing the brunt of the conflict.
So once you destroy a society like this to this extent, the trauma is deep set. If you look at this, the country itself, the infrastructure, if you look at the cultural configuration, the divide, the destruction of the society as they did in Iraq, the whole idea was to create the creative chaos as Condoleezza Rice spoke about. We're finding the same thing happening in Syria. Do you think it's going to take a very, very long time for this society to rebuild itself, not only structurally and in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of human development and human cohesion?
Well, I mean, if you look at Syria today, you will see areas that have been completely flattened as a result of the conflict. They have been flattened not just because of ground operations, but also because Russia and the regime have been using fighter jets in order to attack neighborhoods and really make them uninhabitable. So now there are whole areas that will need basically a generation to go back to how they were before the war. And this is actually the economic outlook for Syria, that to return the Syrian economy to the level that it was at in 2011 before the conflict broke out would take a generation. So that alone should give us a bit of a timeline. At the same time, statistics show that on average, people who become refugees do not come back to their areas of origin for 17 years. So, 17 years. Yes. So here we are talking basically about a problem that's going to be with us for decades. This is not a conflict that's going to end and all of a sudden things will, be restored to how they were. And these two statistics that I mentioned about the economy and refugees, of course, do not even touch the matter of human suffering. That is something that will stay with people for the rest of their lives. The atrocities that people have endured in Syria are causing the kind of trauma that cannot be erased even, decades later. So we have to really think about these issues very seriously if we are to imagine the future of Syria. Unfortunately, it is looking really grim.
Yeah, and we speak about a political solution, but that political solution will eventually have to address much of the trauma, because in South Africa, for instance, we reached a political solution without addressing, the trauma, the pain, and then allowing for the opportunity for memory to impact and for healing to come into process. And we're beginning to see the fallout now. And yet it was perhaps, a different scenario to the kind of trauma that you're facing in Syria. And as you said, human dignity, etc., and the family honor plays a huge part. But I want to come to another very important and problematic issue, which I came across when I was doing my research, and this was following the Zionist tactics inside of Syria. For example, the displacement of people and then occupation of their homes. And I believe that in certain areas of Syria where the people were forced to move out, Sunni families were forced to move out, then Shias were resettled from either Iran or from Hezbollah's Lebanon or from different parts of Syria into the homes of those people. The registries were destroyed and land ownership was then appropriated. So is this a reality, or was this another fixation, another false narrative? Because this is the argument.
Well, what is happening in Syria is that the regime now is taking back more and more areas, and it doesn't want the original inhabitants of these areas that had fled in the conflict to come back. So it is engaging in measures to prevent them from coming back, such as a new law that was issued called Law Number 10, which is about property rights. And it says to people that in order to claim ownership of your property, you need to show up in person or have a close relative show up in person to your local governorate center or municipality, showing documents that prove this ownership. Now, of course, with a lot of people having fled, either without documents or even if they had the documents, they know that if they were to go back and show up, they're going to be arrested or worse. This is not going to happen in any large scale, that people will be able to prove ownership of their property. And so the government then says, well, now we have the right to confiscate your property. So what is happening is a process of demographic change in which the regime is emptying areas as much as possible from their original residents, because this makes it easier for the regime to rule these areas, especially with its reduced capacity now after the many years of the conflict. But also it's a way to punish these residents of areas that rose against the regime. Now, the issue of sectarian kind of demographic change, it is happening on a limited scale. There are some villages that have been emptied of their Sunni residents and replaced with Shia, and that's because of their strategic location. Yes. And so what the regime is trying to do is create cohesive communities in strategic points. So it wants, especially in loyalist areas, to have only people that it knows will be loyal to it occupy these areas. And it's as I said, punishing other people by making it very difficult for them to even claim any right to their properties.
So in many instances there is a madness, in my opinion. There's a madness in Syria that Assad could do this to his own people. And why would he want to continue doing this, destroy his own country? I mean, like you said, level it in certain areas with the Russian cooperation and still stay in power. What is the logic behind this?
I think the logic, which of course is not really logic, but from the perspective of Assad himself, goes all the way back to 1971 when his own father orchestrated a coup in Syria that brought him to power. We're talking about Hafez al-Assad. Since then, the regime in Syria has always referred to Syria as Assad's Syria, in Arabic, Surya al-Assad. So basically, they see the country as belonging to them. And this is why when you have a person putting themselves ahead of the country, they look at people not as citizens, but as subjects, and worse, as people they basically own. And therefore, they feel that the life and death of the people is in their own hands. So essentially, we're talking about a dictator playing God.
So it is again about the hand of Assad ruling from beyond the grave, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the continuation of the regime till eternity, which is one of the famous slogans of the Ba'ath Party that rules Syria.
Do you think that there's going to be a political solution in sight? Or there is a political solution in sight?
Well, unfortunately, right now, I don't see any evidence of political will on part of any of the international actors to push this conflict towards a settlement. It seems that the UN has been largely ineffective. The United States doesn't even seem to have a policy on Syria. European countries wait for a signal from Washington that it's not going to come anytime soon. And the regional actors, sadly, in the Arab world have just made the situation worse. And of course, Iran and Russia have their own interests and they feel that they are achieving them. So why would they compromise and have a settlement when they think they're doing quite well in terms of achieving their goals? So unfortunately, no political solution on the horizon.
One last question, which seems to be the question that everyone's struggling with. And I have to give you a time because we're at the end. The question is, why are all these countries interested in Syria? It doesn't have much resources. It's strategic, but not really strategic. It's not powerful enough. Why the interest in Syria? Why the proxy war in Syria?
Well, Syria is both a civil war and a proxy war mixed together. And it depends on the actors. For example, for Iran, Syria is the place that it used to send weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon through, and where Hezbollah used to train, and still does, its troops. So losing Syria would mean being basically separated from this very key ally in Lebanon, and which would mean the end of Iran's influence in the Levant. For Russia, Syria is a way to stand up to the West at a very cheap cost and also to have a foothold on the Mediterranean. For the Gulf countries that supported the rebels, for example, against the regime, it's an opportunity to make up for the losses that they felt they endured in Iraq because Iran came to be the most prominent actor there and they felt that they can't let this happen again with Syria. So each actor is in Syria not because of Syria but because of what Syria offers them and their own political interests.
A lot of it is arrogance.
That too.
Arrogance and ego. But thank you very much for sharing these insights with me and for making this time. I hope you feel better and enjoy the rest of your stay in South Africa.
Thank you so much.
And inshallah we'll meet again and we can hopefully next time discuss a positive outlook for Syria. في أمان الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت